There are silences so heavy they bend the air, like the one between two men who once called each other brothers. In the quiet of his forge, a farrier listens to the sound of rain on tin, each drop echoing the words he never said. Then one night, a familiar horse limps through the storm, her breath ragged, her eyes filled with a pain he recognizes. He knows who sent her. He knows what it means. As iron meets flame and guilt meets grace, the silence between them begins to speak. The forge breathed like a living thing, iron sighing under flame, the bellows groaning with the rhythm of an old heart. Elias worked alone beneath the low rafters, each strike of his hammer scattering sparks that rose, fluttered, and died against the black ceiling. Outside, the wind prowled along the valley's spine, bending the tall grass, pressing against the warped door as if eager to enter. The smell of wet earth seeped in through the cracks, mingling with iron and smoke. Elias's face glowed amber in the firelight, his eyes hollowed by years of silence. The ring of metal was the only sound that dared to fill the room, steady, deliberate, almost prayerful. He moved like a man who had learned to measure life in strikes and pauses, in the distance between breath and regret. A storm gathered on the horizon. Its low growl rolled across the hills, echoing off the barn's tin roof. The horses in the adjacent stalls shifted uneasily, their hooves tapping in quiet protest. Elias stopped to listen. He always could sense a storm before it arrived, the change in pressure, the way the air thickened like a held breath. He set down his hammer and wiped the sweat from his brow, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the bucket of water. For a moment, he stood still. The forge hissed behind him, but his gaze drifted toward the far wall where an old horseshoe hung alone, bent, imperfect, one nail still rusted in place. He had never removed it. It belonged to Solace, the mare that had carried the weight of his worst mistake. Even now, years later, her name rose like smoke in his mind. A gust of wind forced open the door, scattering ash across the floor. Rain began to fall in thick sheets, drumming against the roof and flooding the soundscape until the world outside vanished into grey. Elias moved to secure the latch, muttering softly to the storm as he always did, an old habit of lonely men. But then, through the noise came something else, a hollow, deliberate knock on wood. 3 times. Slow, hesitant. He froze, his hand still on the doorframe. Visitors were rare in this part of the valley, rarer still after dark. The last time someone had stood at his door in the rain, it had been Samuel, and that had been the night everything burned. Elias hesitated, the hammer's weight suddenly heavy in his palm. Then came another sound, the muffled whicker of a horse, strained and uneven. He opened the door. Rain swept in like a living tide. A figure stood in the downpour, half-shadowed by lightning. The man's coat clung to his frame, soaked through, and behind him stood a mare whose legs quivered beneath her weight. The animal's eyes rolled white in the dim light, her breath sharp and visible in the cold air. For a heartbeat, neither man spoke. "Elias," the stranger said at last. The voice was rough, older than memory, but unmistakable. "She won't stand." Elias's chest tightened. His name in Samuel's voice cut deeper than any blade. He stepped aside wordlessly, and the man led the mare inside. Rainwater pooled on the earthen floor, glinting like quicksilver in the forge light. The horse's flank trembled as she leaned against the post, her pain breathing through the room. Elias turned back to the fire, feeding it instinctively, the glow rising between them like a wall and a bridge all at once. He didn't ask questions. Samuel didn't offer explanations. Outside, thunder cracked, shaking the valley. Inside, only the hiss of steam and the soft rasp of the horse's breath filled the silence, a silence thick with years, unspoken guilt, and the faint scent of redemption waiting, patient in the rain. Before the silence, there had been laughter, the kind that carried across fields and echoed through open barns, unburdened by shame. Elias and Samuel had grown up on neighboring land, two boys bound by the rhythm of hooves and dust. They learned early that the valley spoke in sounds no man could own, the creak of leather, the low hum of wind through fences, the hush of horses breathing together before dawn. By the time they were men, they had built their own small workshop at the valley's edge, a place half forge, half stable. Elias handled the iron, Samuel the horses. Together they had made a living out of repairing the broken, horses, wagons, sometimes even people. The valley folk trusted them implicitly. Those two, old Mrs. Holloway used to say, could fix a soul with a rasp and a kind word. Their partnership was seamless. Samuel's energy was wildfire, reckless, warm, always seeking the horizon, while Elias worked like stone shaped by water, slow but certain. Where Samuel found opportunity, Elias found balance. They filled each other's silences with motion and purpose. Then came Solace. She was a chestnut mare with eyes the colour of river silt and a spirit that refused taming. Found half-starved and skittish at an abandoned property up valley, she'd been passed between ranchers until Samuel brought her to their care, her ribs showing beneath her coat, her trust long stripped away. It was Elias who first approached her, bare hands, slow movements, no rope. For days he sat near her pen, talking softly about nothing, letting her learn his breathing. When Solace finally let him touch her muzzle, Samuel laughed, full and loud, clapping him on the back. "You've got the patience of a saint, brother." Or a fool, Elias had only smiled. Patience and fooling are often the same thing. Under their care, Solace became more than an animal. She was their reflection. Samuel called her wild light. Elias called her grace on four legs. When they rode, she seemed to understand both their rhythms, listening to two hearts as though they beat the same. In those days, the forge was alive with talk and music. Samuel would whistle while Elias hammered. The metal song joined the tune, and sometimes the horses joined too, snorting as if to keep time. Evenings ended with the two sitting on the old fence, passing a flask back and forth while the sun melted behind the hills. But pride, like rust, works quietly. Samuel wanted more. He began talking about leaving the valley, joining a breeding stable 2 towns over where they were looking for trainers. "We're wasting time here," he'd said once, polishing Solace's bridle. "You could come with me."
"Imagine what we could build," Elias had shaken his head. "I've got all I need."
"The work's honest here. The horses, this forge, it's enough." "Enough for you," Samuel replied, not unkindly, but with that edge ambition sharpens. "Some of us want to leave something behind." The conversation ended there, but something between them had shifted. The next weeks were quieter. Samuel began spending more time away, taking jobs without Elias, pushing himself harder, faster. He began training Solace alone, testing her limits. Elias watched from the sidelines, uneasy. He saw the tension in the mare's muscles, the mistrust flickering back into her eyes. One evening, Samuel arrived breathless at the forge, holding up a ribbon.
"They said she's the fastest in the county."
"Took her to the meet this morning. One clean." Elias's face had remained still, but something in his tone was iron when he asked, "Did she run for pride or fear?" Samuel's grin faltered. "Don't ruin this, Eli. We finally have something worth showing." Elias had turned back to the anvil. "She's not a trophy, Sam. She's a life you borrowed." The words struck deeper than either realized. After that, the laughter stopped echoing quite as far. They still worked together, still shared bread and silence, but the ease was gone. Solace, too, grew restless. She pawed the ground during storms, stared toward the hills,
as if sensing the fracture between the hands that fed her. The night before it all fell apart.
Samuel sat outside the forge, while Elias shod Solace's hind hoof. "Do you ever regret staying?" he asked suddenly. Elias glanced up, the glow of the fire outlining the lines on his face. "No, regret is for those who run faster than their hearts." Samuel had looked away, jaw tight. "Maybe some of us are just tired of standing still." Neither said good night. By morning, the wind had changed. Clouds pressed low against the valley rim, and Solace whinnied uneasily, scenting the storm long before the men did. In the stillness before the rain, Elias thought he heard her heart beat twice, once for each of them. He should have known then that something precious was about to break. The storm came without warning, a wall of grey sweeping over the valley like a living thing. By dusk the air was thick with the scent of iron and snow, and the horses paced their stalls restlessly.
Samuel was already saddling Solace when Elias entered the stable, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "She's gone down by the creek," Samuel shouted over the wind.
"The young filly from Holloway's farm, she bolted during the storm." Elias looked up sharply. "The bridge is flooding."
"You'll drown before you reach her." But Samuel was already astride Solace, pulling his coat tight against the rain. "She's trapped out there, Eli."
"You know she won't last the night." Lightning tore the sky open, white and merciless. For a moment, the world was nothing but light and noise. Elias caught sight of Samuel's face, set, determined, proud. He'd seen that look before in the forge, in every argument where neither man would yield. "Samuel!" he yelled.
"Wait for it to pass."
But Samuel kicked Solace into motion, vanishing into the storm. Elias cursed under his breath, grabbed his cloak, and followed on foot. The path toward the creek was narrow, the mud sucking at his boots. The world seemed to collapse to colourless shapes. Black trees, white rain, grey breath. The sound of hooves faded, then returned in short bursts. He pressed forward until he reached the ridge overlooking the water. Below, the creek had become a torrent, thrashing through boulders and branches. Across the flooded bank, Samuel was knee-deep in freezing water, shouting at the terrified filly tangled in debris.
Solace reared behind him, her eyes wide, rain streaking her coat like veins of silver. "Samuel!"
Elias called. His voice barely carried.
"You'll get yourself killed." "She's almost free,"
Samuel shouted back.
"Get down here and help me."
Elias hesitated at the edge of the ridge. The bank had already begun to crumble.
One wrong step and he'd be swept away. He could see it, the water clawing at the earth, the weight of his own fear pressing in. Then came the sound he would remember forever. Solace's scream. The mare had panicked.
A flash of lightning sent her rearing, hooves slashing the air. Samuel turned too late. The ground gave beneath her, and both horse and rider slid into the current. Elias dropped to his knees, mud soaking through his clothes. He saw Samuel struggle to free himself as Solace thrashed, the water pulling at her legs. The filly had broken loose and fled, but Solace was trapped against a fallen log, her hind leg pinned between rocks. "Eli!" Samuel's voice was raw.
"She's caught! Help me!"
For a second that lasted an eternity, Elias froze. His heart pounded in his throat. He could feel the pull of fear, the same voice that whispered of risk, of futility, of loss. The current roared, a living monster between them. He took one step forward and stopped. Samuel's face twisted in disbelief.
"Don't you dare stand there!"
Elias's voice broke. "You'll drown if you stay."
"I don't care."
Samuel plunged beneath the water, trying to free Solace's leg. The mare's eyes rolled white. Her breath came in wet gasps. Elias ran along the ridge, searching for a way down, his breath shallow, every nerve screaming to move. The rain blinded him. When he finally found a descent, he slid down the mud bank, landing hard near the water's edge. But Samuel was already waist-deep, gripping Solace's halter, his strength fading. Elias waded in. The cold hit him like a blow. He reached Samuel's shoulder.
"You can't save her if you're dead."
Samuel's reply was a hoarse shout. "Then go!"
"You've done enough standing still for a lifetime."
The words cut deeper than the wind. Elias grabbed for Solace's leg, bracing himself against the current. Together they heaved until the limb came free with a sickening crack.
Solace's cry tore through the valley. "Get her up!"
Elias shouted. Samuel guided her toward the bank, but the mare stumbled, collapsing onto the mud. Her leg bent wrong, broken. They both knelt beside her. The rain softened, turning into mist. For a long moment neither spoke. Solace lay, breathing raggedly, steam rising from her flank. Samuel's hand trembled against her neck. "She's finished," he said quietly. Elias couldn't answer. Samuel looked up, his face pale and wet. "You hesitated," he said.
"Not accusation, just fact."
The words found their way beneath Elias's ribs and stayed there. Elias wanted to explain that fear had gripped him, that he'd tried to find another way down, but the moment for words was gone. Samuel stood, his body shaking with exhaustion.
"I'll take her home," he said, voice breaking.
"You can stay here. Seems you're good at that." He walked away, leading Solace slowly through the shallows. The mare limped, leaning against him, her trust misplaced in both men. Elias watched until they disappeared into the trees, the sound of their struggle fading with the storm. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The creek ran calmer, silver ribbons catching light between stones. Elias sat on the ridge, hands covered in mud and blood, watching steam rise from his breath. When he finally returned to the forge, he hung Solace's shoe on the wall, a bent piece of metal that would never fit any hoof again. He didn't light the fire that morning. The valley seemed to hold its breath, as if even it mourned the fracture between two souls once whole. And in the silence that followed, the hammer never rang again. Years passed like slow rain, steady and unremarkable, wearing down stone and memory alike. The valley changed little, but Elias changed entirely. His forge remained, though time had turned its bright clang into a muted hum. The world that once rang with the laughter of two men and the sharp rhythm of hooves had gone quiet. Silence became his companion, faithful, predictable, undeserving. He rose before dawn each day, feeding the embers of the forge until they glowed dull orange. Horses still came, strays, farmers' teams, travellers from distant towns. Word had spread that the Farrier in Hollow Vale could heal what others couldn't, but they never spoke of his past. They never asked about the limp in his right leg or the hollow space where warmth should have been in his voice. He worked, took his pay, nodded once, and watched them disappear down the road. His hands were rough, scarred, and his eyes took on the colour of the iron he shaped, grey and cold. At night he drank by the forge, staring at Solace's bent horseshoe on the wall. Sometimes he swore he could still hear her, soft breath, hooves shifting in straw. Other nights it was Samuel's voice that came, low and sharp, carried on the wind that slipped between the cracks. "You hesitated." He would answer aloud, as if the valley could judge him less than he judged himself. "I tried, but even he no longer believed the words." Seasons folded into one another. Winters buried the valley in white. Summers cracked the earth dry. Each time, Elias remained in his forge, reshaping what others had broken, axles, hinges, hooves. The rhythm kept him alive but unchanging, a penance hammered into the days. The villagers whispered. Some said the Farrier had been cursed. Others said he was a ghost himself, working off some old sin.
He never corrected them.
The truth was simpler. He had outlived forgiveness, or so he thought. Then one spring, a stranger came riding down the valley road, a young boy with a patched coat and a nervous gelding. "Sir," the boy said, "I was told you can fix what's lame." Elias nodded, setting his hammer aside. The horse's leg trembled, the hoof split and uneven. He crouched low, running a calloused hand along the limb, feeling the warmth beneath the hair, the faint pulse of pain.
"She's not beyond healing," he said softly. The boy exhaled in relief.
"Father says she's no good now." Elias looked up, meeting the boy's hopeful eyes. "And maybe your father's wrong." The boy smiled, and something within Elias cracked, small and dangerous. He hadn't smiled at another soul in years. When the horse walked steady again 2 weeks later, the boy brought him a loaf of bread and a simple note that said, "Thank you for helping her stand." Elias kept the note folded in his pocket for months. But peace is a fragile thing in the hands of the guilty. That winter, he dreamed of the creek again. The sound of rushing water chased him through sleep, Samuel's voice echoing louder each night. The dreams left him trembling, the air around him charged with something electric, like the valley itself remembered what he had tried to bury. It was then that the letter arrived. A stranger rode in one evening just as the light thinned to gold. He dismounted quietly, handed Elias an envelope and said, "He asked me to deliver this, sir. Said you'd understand." The paper was damp at the edges, the writing faint. Samuel's hand. Elias sat at his workbench, the letter unopened, staring at it for a long time. The forge popped softly behind him, shadows bending with each flare. When he finally broke the seal, only a few words waited inside. "She's hurt."
"And I can't do it alone." He read it twice, then a third time.
The handwriting trembled in the last line, as if written by a man who no longer trusted his own strength. Elias set the letter down. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the air heavy. He reached instinctively toward Solace's old shoe on the wall, his fingers brushing its cool edge. He should have felt anger, resentment for being summoned by the man who had never forgiven him. But instead all he felt was a deep, hollow ache that might have been relief. Samuel was still alive, and somewhere, out there, another horse waited. Outside, the valley had turned silver with rain. The smell of wet earth filled the air sharp and clean. Elias packed his tools slowly, wrapping them in old burlap, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. When he stepped outside, he paused to listen. The rain on the roof sounded like distant hooves, steady, rhythmic, inevitable. He looked back at the forge, once before closing the door. The glow from the dying coals lit Solace's shoe one last time, its shape half shadow, half memory, as he walked into the rain. The letter folded in his pocket, the valley around him seemed to wake from its long slumber. Mist rolled through the grasslands, and somewhere in the distance a single horse whinnied, a low, aching call that might have been a greeting or a warning. Elias whispered into the wind, his voice low. "I'm coming." The valley answered with silence, but it was not the same silence he had carried all these years. It was alive, waiting, full of the possibility of forgiveness. By the time Elias reached the old trail that led toward Samuel's land, night had settled heavy and wet. Rain clung to the grass, turning the road to black glass under the moon. The valley was quieter than he remembered, stripped bare by years of wind and solitude. Each step his mare took sounded hollow, as if echoing into old memories rather than earth. He found Samuel's place by instinct. The forged light of another man's guilt always finds its twin. The house looked the same, though weathered and bent by time. Fences leaned like tired shoulders. The air smelled faintly of hay, oil, and decay. Then he saw her. The mare stood beneath the awning, her coat slick with rain, her body trembling. A deep wound darkened the flesh near her fetlock, swelling like fire beneath skin. She was young, but her eyes, those eyes, caught Elias's breath in his throat. They were Solace's eyes, down to the flecks of amber near the pupil. A shape emerged from the shadows. Samuel. He looked smaller somehow, worn around the edges. His beard had turned to frost, his back bent slightly. But his voice, though low and cracked, still carried that steady core. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. Elias dismounted slowly. "I read your letter." "Then you know I wouldn't have written it unless I had to." The old tension hung between them, like smoke that never cleared. But the mare's trembling cut through it. Elias stepped closer, and Samuel did not stop him. Together they watched her breathe, each rise of her flank a plea neither man could ignore. "What happened?" Elias asked quietly. "Fence post split during the last storm. She got tangled trying to break free." Samuel exhaled, shaking his head.
"She's Solace's foal.
Bred her 3 winters ago. Thought she might carry something good forward." Elias knelt beside the mare, his hand moving carefully along her leg. The swelling was bad, the skin hot. "If it's deep, infection's already setting in," he murmured. "I'll need fire and clean water." "Then you know where the forge is." He did. The moment he stepped inside, memory came alive, the layout nearly identical to the one he'd built years ago. Only this forge burned lower, slower, as if the air itself remembered too much. He lit the coals, fed them until their glow deepened to the color of old blood. The rhythm came back easily: hammer, breath, flame, silence. Outside, Samuel held the mare steady while Elias cleaned the wound. Neither spoke, but the sounds of their labor filled the air. The hiss of boiling water, the rustle of straw, the deep, measured breathing of the horse. When Elias finally spoke, it was not to Samuel but to her.
"Easy now, girl."
"The pain will pass soon." The mare turned her head slightly, nostrils flaring. For a moment, her eyes met his again, and Elias saw something he hadn't felt in years. Trust. It broke something open in him, raw and unexpected. Samuel must have sensed it too. "She listens to you," he said softly. Elias didn't answer. He wrapped the leg, his hands steady, movements sure. Each gesture was both act and apology, as if the healing of this animal could reach backward through time. When they were done, Samuel led the mare into the stall, and Elias followed. The forge light flickered behind them, dancing against their faces. Samuel leaned on the doorframe, watching the horse breathe. "You haven't changed," he said at last. Elias gave a faint, bitter smile.
"I have, just not in ways worth showing." Samuel looked away. "You could have come back sooner." Elias's voice was quiet.
"You could have asked." For a while there was only the sound of rain on the roof. Then Samuel sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Maybe I thought you'd earned your silence. Or maybe you just didn't want to hear mine." That broke whatever dam still held between them. Samuel turned.
Anger flashing, years of bitterness and pride sparking to life.
"You left her to die, Eli. You left me to face it." Elias's reply came out rough. "I didn't mean to."
"Fear took me before thought could. That's not what I needed."
Samuel's voice cracked, echoing in the rafters.
"I needed you beside me."
The words hit harder than the storm ever could. Elias felt the weight of them settle, familiar, deserved. He lowered his gaze. "I know. And that's the truth I've lived with since." The rain slowed. The mare shifted, resting her head against the stall. Her breath filled the silence, slow, steady, alive. When Samuel finally spoke again, his voice was small. "Can you save her?" Elias looked at the wound, the bindings, the faint tremor of pain in the mare's leg.
"I don't know," he said. "But I'll try." Samuel nodded once.
No more words?
No forgiveness offered, none asked.
Just 2 men standing in the ghostlight of everything they'd ruined, united again by something more fragile than mercy, a shared act of care. Outside, The storm moved east, leaving behind a hush so deep it bordered on sacred. The forge's glow spilled through the open door, illuminating the valley in faint pulses of orange. For the first time in years, Elias's hands didn't shake. The days that followed unfolded like a slow confession, one word, one breath, one small mercy at a time. The valley's storms had passed, but inside Samuel's stable, the air remained thick with unspoken things. Elias rose before dawn each morning, rekindling the forge and cleaning Ember's wound, while Samuel hauled water from the well and changed the straw. They spoke little, but their silence no longer felt like a weapon. It was work, living and shared. The mare, Ember, fought through the pain. Her legs swelled, skin tight with fever. At times she lay trembling, eyes wide with the kind of fear that lives beyond instinct. Elias knew that look well. It was the same terror that had haunted him every night since Solace's fall. He whispered to her the way he once had to her mother, his voice low and patient.
"Stay with me, girl. You're not alone this time." Samuel watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable.
There were moments when Ember lifted her head to Elias's voice that something in Samuel's face softened. But pride dies slower than wounds heal, and old guilt clings harder than rust. One afternoon, while cleaning the leg, Elias caught Samuel's reflection in the trough water. The man looked hollowed out, his strength spent. He said quietly, "You've carried this alone too long." Samuel didn't answer. He turned toward the open door, where sunlight spilled like forgiveness across the floor. "You think tending a horse fixes what's broken between us?" Elias wrung out the cloth.
"No, but it's a start." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You should have been there that night." "I know." The simplicity of his answer stopped Samuel.
The words hung in the air like smoke, curling, settling. For the first time, Elias didn't defend himself, didn't try to explain away his hesitation. He met Samuel's gaze fully, the weight of years laid bare in his eyes. "And I'll spend whatever's left of my life trying to make it right." For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain through the open doorway. Somewhere in the distance, thunder muttered softly. The kind that comes from far beyond the mountains. Too distant to threaten, just close enough to remember. That night, they sat outside the stable, a small lantern flickering between them. The world around them was still damp, the earth breathing out mist. Samuel poured 2 cups of bitter coffee, passing one across without a word. Elias took it, hands rough against the chipped metal. "You still forge every day?" Samuel asked after a while. "When there's work?" "And when there isn't?" Elias looked at the dark shape of the hills. "Then I make something small.
Nails, hinges?"
Things that hold other things together." Samuel let out a tired laugh. "Guess that's fitting." They drank in silence, the tension between them slowly unwinding, not erased, but thinned by time, by the gentle persistence of shared breath. Days stretched into weeks. Ember began to heal. The swelling eased, her stance steadied. She still limped, but her eyes grew brighter, her appetite returned. Elias watched every small improvement like a miracle. Each step she took seemed to stitch another thread through the torn fabric of the past. Then came the night the storm returned. It wasn't like the others, no warning, no gentle roll of thunder on the horizon. It struck fast and violent, tearing across the valley with a vengeance. Wind battered the roof, lightning splintered the sky. The horses panicked, kicking their stalls. Elias and Samuel rushed into the stable, shouting over the storm's howl, "Hold her!" Elias called as Ember reared, the whites of her eyes flashing. Samuel grabbed the halter, pulling her head down, trying to calm her.
Rain poured through a loose seam in the roof, drenching the straw. "She's going to break free,"
Samuel shouted. Elias grabbed a rope, looping it around a beam, but the wind tore through again, shaking the building to its bones. A loud crack split the air, timber snapping. One of the roof beams groaned, then gave way. "Samuel, get back," Elias yelled. The beam fell. Time slowed. Lightning froze the scene in white. Elias saw the arc of the collapsing wood, the panic in Ember's eyes, Samuel's body too close. Without thought, he lunged. The beam struck his shoulder, the impact flinging him sideways.
Pain exploded down his arm, but he forced himself forward, wrapping his body between the horse and the falling debris.
Ember shrieked, hooves thrashing, but he held fast. Samuel dragged him out as the roof buckled further, pulling him into the rain. The stable roof caved in behind them, fire and rain colliding as the forge inside ignited.
Orange light bled into the downpour, smoke curling upward like a soul leaving its body. "Elias!"
Samuel shouted, kneeling beside him. Blood mixed with water streaking across Elias's face. His left arm hung limp, bent unnaturally. "She—" Elias tried to speak, his voice ragged.
She's alive," Samuel said.
His tone cracked under the weight of it. "She's standing." Elias exhaled, a broken sound that might have been laughter. Then it was worth it. Samuel gripped his shoulder.
"You fool. You didn't have to—" "I did," Elias whispered.
"It wasn't her I was saving."
"It was us." The words hung between them, fragile as glass, unshattered only because the storm had taken everything else. They stayed there until the rain softened, watching the forge burn itself down to embers.
The valley smelled of smoke and wet earth, of endings and beginnings mingled. Ember stood just beyond the ruin, trembling but alive, her coat glistening in the light. By morning, the fire was out. The stable was gone, half the roof collapsed, the forge blackened. Samuel moved through the wreckage like a man walking through memory, his hands tracing the charred timbers. He stopped beside Elias, who sat propped against a beam, his arm bound in cloth, his face pale but calm. "You'll need a new forge," Samuel said quietly. Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe, but not the same one." Samuel looked at him for a long time, something shifting in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or forgiveness? He nodded once. "I'll help you build it, for the first time in years." Elias believed him. In the days that followed, they worked side by side again, gathering wood.
Salvaging iron, the rhythm returned.
Not as it had been, but as something gentler, wiser. Each strike of the hammer no longer echoed guilt. It sang of survival. When Ember took her first steps outside, the morning sun lit the valley in gold. She moved carefully, her limp still visible, but her spirit intact. Samuel stood beside Elias, watching. "She'll carry a scar," he said. "So will we," Elias replied. The breeze shifted, lifting the smoke toward the horizon. It smelled clean now, like rain on fresh ash. The kind of scent that follows fire when the world begins to heal. Elias turned to Samuel, his voice low.
"I never said it then. I should have." Samuel's eyes flicked to him.
"Said what?" "I'm sorry." The words were simple, quiet, but they carried the weight of a decade's silence, and for once they didn't fall empty. Samuel nodded, no words needed. And in that shared quiet, amidst ruin and renewal, the valley finally exhaled. Morning came soft and gold, breaking through the remnants of smoke that still lingered over the valley. The forge lay in ruin, but the air carried the smell of life again. Wet hay, fresh timber, the faint sweetness of horses breathing steady. The storm had washed everything raw, leaving only what mattered behind. Elias stirred awake on the old cot Samuel had dragged into the barn. His shoulder burned, wrapped in linen and salve, but the pain felt clean, earned. Beside him, Samuel sat on an overturned bucket, staring out toward the hills where the mist still clung to the grass. Neither spoke for a long while. There was no need. The silence had changed, no longer sharp, but wide, soft-edged, forgiving. Ember stood nearby, grazing clumsily on the wet straw. Her leg was bound in fresh bandage, the swelling eased, her breath calm. She looked at them both with that same steady, unblinking gaze that horses hold, the kind that sees through what words hide. Elias felt her eyes on him like absolution. "She's walking," he murmured. Samuel nodded. She stood before sunrise.
"I didn't think she would." Elias smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth twitching beneath the stubble.
"She had help," Samuel turned to him. "You risked your life, Eli, again. I owed her that," Elias said quietly.
"And you?" Samuel looked away, blinking hard. "You don't owe me anything," but Elias shook his head. "You're wrong. I owed you the truth."
"And I owed her a chance." The wind moved gently through the doorway, carrying the faint clang of distant bells from the grazing pasture. The valley seemed to hum with quiet renewal. Later that day, the two men began clearing what was left of the forge. Charred beams, twisted nails, fragments of tools, the detritus of both their pasts. Samuel carried out the debris while Elias, with one good arm, salvaged what could still be used. They worked slowly, carefully, like men handling the bones of something sacred. When they uncovered the anvil, still intact beneath the ash, Elias rested his hand on it, closing his eyes. The metal was cool, solid, unmoved by flame or time. He exhaled softly. "Guess she still stands," he said. Samuel glanced at him. Like her owner, Elias looked up, meeting his eyes. For the first time in years, Samuel's gaze held no accusation, no guarded distance, just the plain honesty of shared survival. By late afternoon, the light turned amber, painting everything in warmth. Ember wandered the paddock, favoring her leg, but moving freely, each step steadier than the last. Samuel leaned against the fence, arms crossed.
"You think she'll ever run?"
Elias joined him, the smell of burnt oak and fresh grass mixing in the air. "Maybe not like her mother, but she'll walk without fear." "That's enough," Samuel nodded. "Maybe that's enough for us, too." The words lingered, gentle and certain. As the sun lowered, Elias took a small, bent horseshoe from his pack. The same one he'd carried for years, Solace's last. He turned it over in his hands, the metal darkened by time, but still unbroken. He walked to the edge of the paddock, knelt, and pressed it into the soil near the fence post, half buried but visible. "She can rest here now," he said. Samuel watched silently, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "You always did know how to finish things." Elias looked up, eyes glinting with faint humor. "Not always, but I try." As dusk settled, they built a small fire outside the barn. Sparks rose into the dark, echoing the night years ago when everything had fallen apart. Only now, the firelight warmed rather than accused. They ate in companionable silence, listening to Ember's slow breathing in the stable. After a while, Samuel said softly, "You know, I used to think forgiveness was something given, a word you say to make peace, and now?" Elias asked. Samuel stared into the fire. "Now I think it's something you earn by staying, by not walking away when it hurts," Elias nodded. "Then maybe we both found it tonight." The fire cracked softly, sending embers spinning into the night. Overhead, the stars began to show, faint at first, then brightening as the valley's mist lifted. The forge might have been gone, but its light lived on in smaller, quieter forms, in the glow of the coals, in the warmth between two men who had finally found a way to speak without words. When Samuel rose to leave, he paused by the paddock. Ember lifted her head, her breath visible in the cooling air. Samuel reached out, touched her neck. "She's strong," he said. Elias smiled, his voice steady and soft. "She had good hands to guide her." Samuel looked at him one last time. "We both did." As he walked down the road toward the sleeping hills, Elias stood alone by the fence, watching the last of the light fade. The silence that filled the valley no longer hurt. It breathed. It lived. He turned back toward the forge's ruins, the anvil gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Tomorrow he would begin again. Weeks passed, and the valley began to bloom again. Spring came softly that year, as if aware that the land and the men who tended it had already survived enough. Grass pushed through the ash around the ruined forge, tender green against blackened earth. The river, once wild and cruel, now murmured gently over smooth stones. Even the wind seemed to move differently, no longer carrying ghosts, but the faint scent of renewal. Elias worked slowly, methodically. His shoulder healed in fits and starts, stiff but serviceable. Samuel kept his word. He returned each morning, bringing lumber and tools from the village. Together they rebuilt, not a replica of the old forge, but something humbler, open to the air, where light could fall freely. The anvil stood again in the center, burnished clean, its surface reflecting the sunrise like a promise. Some evenings, when work was done, they sat in the doorway watching Ember graze in the pasture beyond. Her limp remained, a faint shadow in her gait, but it no longer slowed her. She had learned to trust her footing again. One evening, as the sun folded itself behind the western ridge, Samuel spoke without turning. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Elias smiled faintly. "Once, or maybe. But the valley keeps what it forgives." Samuel chuckled under his breath. "Then I guess we're both staying." They shared the quiet comfortably. No more. Storms between them, just the familiar music of the forge cooling, the soft clink of metal settling, and the steady rhythm of horses breathing somewhere close. When Samuel finally did leave again, it was not out of anger or escape. He went to tend his land, rebuild his home. Before he left, he pressed something into Elias's palm, a single nail, hand-forged, polished bright. "For the new roof," he said. "You always built things that lasted." Elias watched him ride away until he disappeared around the bend, the sound of hooves fading into wind. Then he turned back to the forge, the nail warm in his hand. That night, Elias lit the fire once more. Sparks rose into the dark, scattering like stars. The valley glowed faintly under the moon, the air rich with the smell of burning oak and wet soil. Ember stood by the fence, watching him with soft, curious eyes. Her breath fogged in the cool air, each exhale slow and steady. He spoke softly, not to her exactly, but to the space between them, the silence that had once divided, now whole again. "You carried the weight for us, didn't you, girl?" he said. "All this time." The mare flicked her ears, snorted softly, then stepped closer until her muzzle brushed his arm. He felt the warmth of her breath against his skin, the same quiet strength that had saved them both. In that moment, Elias understood. Some debts are repaid not through words or acts of heroism, but through endurance, through the simple grace of staying alive long enough to make things right. He reached into his coat and drew out the folded scrap of Samuel's letter. The ink had faded, but he still knew every word by heart. "She's hurt, and I can't do it alone." He smiled, a quiet, weathered curve of peace. "Neither could I," he whispered. The forge crackled, sparks drifting upward like fireflies. The valley stretched wide and golden beneath the stars, alive again. The old wounds had not vanished, but they had found a place to rest. Elias lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the first blush of dawn began to rise, a light as gentle as forgiveness. Behind him, The mare breathed, steady and patient. The sound filled the air between them, soft and eternal, and when he finally turned to face the day, the silence between horses was no longer something to bear. It was something to keep.